December 7, 1941. Just after dawn, smoke and fire still lingered over Pearl Harbor. On scattered decks and piers, corpsmen crouched beside the wounded, improvising bandages out of torn shirts, morphine vials clattering in their hands. Japanese pilots, returning to their carriers, wrote of seeing the harbor still smoldering and expected chaos to reign for weeks. Yet, as the Pacific War unfolded, an unexpected sight would astonish not only their soldiers but also their trained medical personnel. American frontline camps with clinics so advanced, so methodical, that they rivaled city hospitals back home. To the Japanese, whose field units carried only the most basic medical supplies, the idea seemed unthinkable. It was a silent weapon, organization, logistics, and compassion made into steel and syringes. U.S. Navy Medical Report, December 1941. In the jungles of Guadalcanal, 1942, the Japanese infantry suffered tropical fevers, dysentery, and festering wounds left untreated for days. A soldier's fate often rested on whether he could stagger back to a base tent or succumb quietly beneath the canopy. Meanwhile, just a few miles across the line, U.S. Marines had tented wards with cots arranged in neat rows, powered sterilizers hissing in the corner, and even rudimentary X-ray machines humming under canvas. Nurses and Navy corpsmen kept meticulous records, took blood pressure, and hung plasma bottles carefully on makeshift racks. The contrast was not only military but cultural to many Japanese observers. Trained to expect endurance over comfort, such clinics appeared surreal, a luxury out of place in the mud and gunfire of the Solomon Islands. Guadalcanal Diary, 1943. The disparity was not accidental. By 1942, the U.S. Army Medical Department and Navy Bureau of Medicine had standardized mobile hospital units, each packed into trucks and crates, deployable within hours. A single 400-bed evacuation hospital could unfurl across a clearing like a conjured village, its operating rooms shaded under tarpaulin roofs, its generators powering electric lamps that banished jungle night. Engineers at companies like General Electric and Westinghouse had adapted civilian sterilization and refrigeration systems for frontline use, ensuring blood plasma remained viable and surgical tools stayed free from infection. Bureau of Medicine and Surgery Report, 1942. 4 Japanese nurses. The shock was double-edged. In captured accounts, they described stumbling upon American camps after raids, finding not just wounded tended but recoveries planned, men walking again with splints, and carefully rationed quinine and penicillin administered with precision. Their own field services, bound by the Imperial Army's doctrine of self-reliance, carried limited supplies, a few sulfa tablets, gauze, and an unshakable reliance on soldiers' willpower. Where American units sought to preserve manpower through medicine, Japanese planners assumed attrition as a natural cost of the campaign. Bundesarchiv, Captured Japanese Field Report, 1944. By mid-1943, the pattern deepened. At New Georgia, American Seabees cleared ground for medical tents even as artillery still roared, laying pipes to channel rainwater and improvising drainage ditches so mud would not swallow gurneys. Nearby, engineers installed prefabricated wooden frames to steady surgical wards. In contrast, Japanese stretcher-bearers carried their comrades through miles of hostile jungle, wounds untreated until they reached the relative safety of rear islands, often too late. To them, seeing entire American hospitals bloom almost overnight seemed an affront to the very laws of war. Dramatized composite, the difference lay in industrial muscle as much as doctrine. Detroit's auto factories produced not only tanks, but also prefabricated operating tables and collapsible cots. The Ford Motor Company assembled mobile surgical trucks alongside Jeeps. Johnson & Johnson, long a domestic medical supplier, shipped millions of bandages sealed in waxed paper packets, sterile even in swamp heat. The sheer scale of production meant a wounded American could expect clean gauze, morphine, and surgical steel rather than rough cloth and prayer. War Production Board Bulletin, 1943. Japanese officers wrote bitterly about these disparities. One diary from Bougainville noted, "The enemy protects even his weak, as though each man is irreplaceable. We are left to fight on with those who remain." Bundesarchiv, Pilot Diary, 1943. To them, the American clinic was not merely a building. It was a symbol of a philosophy alien to their own: preservation over sacrifice, care over endurance. That philosophy, multiplied by thousands of miles of supply chains, shifted attrition in the Allies' favor. The sensory difference could not be ignored. Imagine the smell of antiseptic cutting through jungle rot, the glow of electric bulbs at midnight contrasting with kerosene lamps sputtering in Japanese camps. The hiss of pressurized oxygen tanks mingled with the cries of wounded men being stabilized for evacuation. Radios crackled with coded requests: send plasma. Request additional quinine. 2 surgical teams inbound. These were not luxuries. They were calculated logistics, ensuring divisions did not bleed out unseen in the undergrowth but returned, patched and emboldened, to the fight. U.S. Army After Action Report, October 1943. At Tarawa in November 1943, American corpsmen waded ashore with not only rifles but also medical satchels designed in Washington workshops. Inside were morphine syrettes, bandage compresses, and sulfa powder, each component tested and mass-produced by engineers who never saw battle but whose inventions decided whether a Marine lived another day. 4 Japanese medical staff captured after the battle. The realization was devastating. Their own supplies amounted to a fraction of what each American carried personally. Naval Medical Bulletin, December 1943. By the time of Saipan in June 1944, the disparity had grown into legend. Marines stormed beaches under fire. And yet, within hours, operating tents were erected in the lee of dunes, surgical lamps were powered by gasoline generators, and sterilized scalpels were laid out on trays. Japanese nurses observed from makeshift aid stations and later wrote with disbelief that Americans could conduct appendectomies and chest surgeries practically at the front line. For them, it was as though the enemy carried an entire homeland's hospital into battle. Captured Japanese nurse account, 1945. The wider context framed this as more than just compassion. In 1944, the U.S. military fielded over 700,000 medical personnel worldwide, including 57,000 nurses, with standardized training and doctrine. The Japanese Army, by contrast, deployed fewer than 3,000 trained nurses across the Pacific, many without adequate supplies. The imbalance reflected broader industrial truths. America's war machine produced not only bombers and carriers but also the infrastructure to sustain its men. Casualty statistics bore the proof. Where untreated wounds claimed thousands of Japanese lives, American survival rates after frontline injury climbed dramatically, reaching 90% in some campaigns. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. By late 1944, as the Philippines campaign began, Japanese medical observers had grown almost numb to the shock. They described American field hospitals as cities of healing, with refrigeration units humming and surgical theaters spotless even amid artillery bombardment. It was a war fought with bullets and bombs, yes, but also with bandages and plasma, antiseptics and generators. To the Americans, this was strategy. To the Japanese, it was sorcery. And yet, this sorcery was not mystical at all. It was the product of workers in Detroit, inventors in New Jersey, engineers in Pennsylvania, and nurses trained in Kansas or Brooklyn who stepped onto Pacific shores with the knowledge of modern science. The battlefield clinic was a weapon, forged not of steel plates, but of refrigeration coils, cotton rolls, and steady hands. The war surged into its bloodiest years. One question loomed in the minds of Japanese observers. If the enemy could build hospitals from nothing, if they could heal as well as they could kill, what secret advantage was driving this machine of war? The answer lay hidden in supply lines, in engineers' blueprints, and in medicines just entering the arsenal of mankind. And it would be revealed in the battles yet to come. The secret was not magic, it was medicine. By 1943, the United States had quietly weaponized the science of health, turning refrigeration trucks, plasma banks, and mobile surgical units into force multipliers as decisive as tanks or bombers. The Japanese could not fathom how, in sweltering jungles and blasted beaches, their enemy maintained sterile operating rooms. The truth lay in supply lines stretching back across the Pacific, powered by the largest industrial medical collaboration the world had ever seen. U.S. Army Medical Service Report, 1943. The core of this advantage was blood. In 1940, Dr. Charles Drew pioneered large-scale plasma storage at Columbia University, developing techniques that allowed blood to be dried, shipped, and reconstituted at the front. By 1943, American troops carried plasma bottles by the crate, each one a soldier's lifeline. A single pint could mean the difference between death from shock and survival after catastrophic wounds. Factories in New Jersey produced plasma units at a rate of 100,000 per month. Engineers at Abbott Laboratories designed glass bottles with rubber stoppers that could withstand transport across oceans. Technical Manual TM 8-227, 1943. Japanese reports, seized after battles in New Guinea, reveal astonishment at the scale. Their field hospitals had no refrigeration to preserve blood. Transfusions, if attempted, required direct donor-to-patient transfers, often under fire, often failing. The sight of Americans calmly hanging plasma bags under canvas tents seemed otherworldly. Dramatized composite. The enemy revives men who should already be ghosts, one Japanese medic scrawled in a diary. Captured diary, Buna campaign, 1943. Another factor was penicillin, though discovered in 1928 by Alexander Fleming. It was American engineers and pharmaceutical firms who scaled it into mass production by 1943. Pfizer's deep tank fermentation plants in Brooklyn churned out tons of the antibiotic, enough to treat every wounded GI in Europe and the Pacific. Soldiers on Guadalcanal or Tarawa received injections that saved them from septicemia, infections that had claimed countless lives in every war before. War Production Board Pharmaceutical Report, 1944, for the Japanese, whose medics still relied on sulfa drugs and herbal poultices. Penicillin seemed as mystical as armor plate. The scale of American medical logistics was staggering. Each U.S. Army evacuation hospital required 300 tons of equipment. Inside, X-ray machines powered by portable generators, autoclaves to sterilize instruments, and surgical tables with adjustable steel frames. Trucks carried collapsible operating theaters designed by engineers at the Detroit Arsenal, where precision machining normally reserved for tanks was applied to medical gear. A fully equipped field hospital could be erected in 36 hours by a team of CBs and nurses, transforming a clearing into a sanctuary of light and order amid chaos. Bureau of Ships Report, 1943. The Japanese, by contrast, transported minimal supplies. Their doctrine assumed wounded men would either recover on their own or perish. In practice, this meant thousands of preventable deaths from dysentery, gangrene, and malaria. Reports from captured Japanese nurses reveal frustration. We watched them die for lack of medicines the enemy carries in boxes by the truckload. Captured nurse account. Philippines, 1944. Nowhere was the contrast clearer than during the Battle of Polillo. September 1944. On D-Day, Marines hit the beaches under withering fire, suffering nearly 1,200 casualties in the first 24 hours. Within hours, Navy corpsmen established aid stations just behind the dunes, hanging plasma bags from palm stumps. Portable radios crackled with calls. Casualty evacuation requested, 2 stretcher teams inbound. On hospital ships offshore, surgical wards hummed with activity, powered by diesel engines, their decks bright with surgical lamps. Over 9,600 wounded passed through these floating hospitals during the battle, with survival rates exceeding 85%. Naval Bureau of Medicine Report, 1945. Japanese soldiers, trapped in caves, listened to the drone of American evacuation planes lifting off from nearby airstrips. Their own comrades bled out in the dark. Captured medics later admitted disbelief that the Americans could save so many so quickly. Dramatized composite. They fight without fear because they know someone waits to heal them, one confessed in interrogation. U.S. Strategic Intelligence Report, 1945. Technology amplified this edge. The U.S. Army Signal Corps coordinated medical evacuations with FM radios, Motorola sets tuned to precise frequencies. A forward platoon medic could relay coordinates for a Jeep ambulance, which raced on roads cleared by engineers. Within hours, a wounded soldier could be on a C-47 evacuation plane bound for a surgical base. This chain of care, radio, Jeep, plane, hospital, was unheard of in Japanese planning. Signal Corps Technical Bulletin, 1944. Engineers also developed innovations that sound mundane but save thousands. The Army Quartermaster Corps issued mosquito netting treated with insecticide, reducing malaria cases by half in certain theaters. Refrigerated trucks, designed by Carrier Corporation, transported plasma and penicillin even in 100-degree heat. Standard Oil refineries adapted gasoline production lines to churn out medical-grade ether for anesthesia. Every element of the American industrial base bent toward sustaining life. Quartermaster Report, 1944. Consider the scale at Leyte in October 1944. Over 200,000 American troops poured into the Philippines. Alongside them came 28 evacuation hospitals, 12 portable surgical units, and 5 fully equipped hospital ships, including USS Relief and USS Solace. Each hospital ship carried 500 beds, X-ray wards, and surgical theaters operating 24 hours a day. Engineers had wired the ships with redundancy, backup generators, and duplicate sterilizers, so operations never ceased. During the campaign, survival rates for wounded Americans hovered near 92%. Japanese forces, by contrast, lost tens of thousands to untreated disease and infection. Naval Hospital Ship Log, 1944. Archival photos show the surreal contrasts. American Marines lying in cots with clean bandages, plasma bottles hanging above them, and nurses in crisp uniforms bending over charts. Just a few miles away, Japanese wounded lay on bamboo mats, flies buzzing, wounds festering, and morphine long exhausted. The battlefield clinic became a silent weapon, a morale engine as potent as artillery. But perhaps the greatest testament to this advantage came not in statistics, but in perception. Japanese nurses and medics consistently wrote of disbelief, describing American clinics as cities of healing. Soldiers whispered rumors that the enemy possessed secret medicines to bring back the dead. What they saw was not resurrection, it was logistics, science, and industrial scale. It was the will of an industrial giant to preserve its sons, no matter the cost. By the final year of the war, even Japanese high command could not deny it. Interrogations after surrender revealed deep frustration that their own wounded were abandoned while Americans seemed invincible. Their strength lies not only in weapons, one officer admitted, but in the certainty that no man is left to die alone. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The battlefield had revealed a hidden truth. America's deadliest advantage was not firepower, but the ability to keep its soldiers alive. And as 1945 dawned, the question shifted. If American medicine could sustain men through hell itself, what impact would it have on the course of campaigns, on morale, and on the very psychology of war? That revelation was still to come. The impact of this medical edge rippled far beyond individual survival. It reshaped entire campaigns. By 1945, American commanders counted on casualty survival rates in their planning. They knew that wounded men would not vanish from the order of battle but would return weeks later, scarred yet ready to fight. This confidence emboldened offensives. At Okinawa, April 1945, over 49,000 Americans were wounded. More than 80% survived. For Japanese defenders, the same island was a graveyard of untreated agony. U.S. Army Medical Department, Final Report 1946. The psychological divide was immense. American soldiers carried a silent assurance. If struck down, they would not be abandoned. Corpsmen with red crosses sewn on their sleeves moved through gunfire, armed with morphine syrettes, plasma packs, and bandages stamped with Johnson & Johnson's logo. Each was a reminder that the industrial homeland stood behind them. Japanese soldiers, conditioned to accept death as duty, saw wounded comrades left behind in caves. Prisoner interrogations after the war recorded a haunting refrain. The Americans fight with courage because they know they will live. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. Strategically, this shifted attrition. In previous wars, heavy casualties often shattered an army's strength. But in the Pacific, the U.S. could suffer 10,000 wounded and still field the same division weeks later, replenished by its own recovered men. Engineers kept this system running. Field technicians repaired X-ray generators under fire. Mechanics serviced refrigeration trucks that preserved blood plasma. Navy electricians rewired hospital ship circuits after kamikaze strikes so surgeries could continue. Their work rarely made headlines, yet it turned industrial capacity into sustained combat power. Bureau of Medicine and Surgery log, 1945. The Japanese were stunned by this resilience. At Saipan, their estimates of American losses predicted collapse after the first week. Instead, fresh battalions surged forward, fueled by soldiers who had been stabilized, treated, and returned to the line. Diaries from surviving Japanese officers describe disbelief. Dramatized composite, they do not wither. They grow stronger after each wound. Captured officer diary, Saipan 1944. This resilience struck deeper than tactics. It cut to morale. American soldiers rode home from hospital ships, letters stained with iodine, telling families they would return. For parents in Kansas or New Jersey, the promise of advanced care softened the dread of the telegram. For soldiers in foxholes, the knowledge that doctors waited just beyond the line created an invisible shield. War was still brutal, but survival was no longer a coin toss. Letters Home Collection, National Archives. The Japanese Medical Corps could not keep pace. Even as nurses struggled valiantly with what little they had, they lacked the industrial scaffolding to support them. They had no Detroit Arsenal machining surgical gear, no Pfizer churning out penicillin, and no Carrier Corporation designing cold storage units. Their wounded faced not just the enemy's bullets, but the inevitability of infection and fever. The result was despair, an erosion of fighting spirit that spread silently through units. Japanese POW interrogation reports, 1945. On Okinawa, the contrast reached its peak. The U.S. Navy deployed 15 hospital ships, each a floating city of medicine. USS Comfort, USS Hope, and USS Sanctuary, all white-hulled, red-crossed, and shining against black smoke. Inside, nurses rotated through 12-hour shifts, and surgeons performed amputations and chest surgeries as shells fell ashore. Over 72,000 patients were treated during the campaign aboard these ships, survival rates rivaling mainland hospitals. Meanwhile, in the island's caves, Japanese soldiers groaned untreated, delirious with gangrene, whispering prayers into darkness. Naval Bureau of Medicine Report, 1946. For American leadership, the benefits extended far beyond the battlefield. Every recovered soldier represented manpower preserved, training retained, and morale sustained. General Eisenhower later remarked that modern medicine saved the equivalent of multiple divisions in manpower. Historians note that without plasma, penicillin, and evacuation systems, Allied casualties might have doubled. Eisenhower Memoirs, 1948. The war ended, but its medical legacy did not. The Cold War absorbed these lessons. Korea saw MASH units deploy in tents near the front, direct descendants of the evacuation hospitals of New Guinea. In Vietnam, helicopter medevac, dust-off, owed its concept to the Jeep ambulances and C-47 evacuations pioneered in the Pacific. By the Gulf War of 1991, rapid evacuation and field hospitals were standard doctrine. The U.S. military no longer measured victory only in firepower, but in survivability. U.S. Army Medical History Office, 1991. For Japan, the war's bitter lesson reshaped medicine too. Post-war reforms emphasized modern hospitals, antibiotics, and preventive care, many introduced by U.S. occupation authorities. Japanese nurses who had once stared in disbelief at American clinics later became the backbone of a reformed system that embraced the very practices they had once called impossible. U.S. Occupation Medical Report, 1947. Yet the human cost remained. Tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians died not from bullets, but from neglect, from untreated wounds that would have been survivable under American care. For families across Japan, this became a silent grief. Children left fatherless not because of enemy strength, but because their empire could not match the enemy's medicine. In the end, America's greatest advantage in the Pacific was not just the carrier or the bomber. It was the ability to turn science into salvation, to bring refrigeration and plasma into jungles, and to give hope in places defined by despair. For the Japanese, the sight of those clinics was both unbelievable and undeniable, a S1 U.S. nurse later recalled. Standing in a field ward on Saipan, we fought not only to save lives, but to prove that even in war, compassion is a weapon. Nurse Oral History Collection, 1952. In modern war, connection outweighs firepower and speed defeats armor. The battlefield clinic, once a marvel to astonished Japanese eyes, became a blueprint for the wars to come, and a reminder that the true measure of strength is not only in how an army kills, but in how it chooses to save.